Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to this inaugural lecture to be delivered by Professor Elizabeth Poole. It is a great pleasure to welcome you here. These lectures are a very important part of the university calendar, an ability for us to show off the prowess of our new professors, whether they've been appointed from outside, but I think a particular pleasure when they are to celebrate the internal promotion of one of our academics who's been here for significant time, and that's the case this evening. They are difficult lectures to give because we have a very wide audience here, and again, it's always a particular pleasure to welcome members of the family of our lecture in any one evening, and some of them have already been warned that laughing at the jokes is allowed, and that is a part of this evening. So, as I say, tonight we're going to hear from Professor Elizabeth Poole, and Liz has an MA in Cultural Studies that she got from Warwick University, and then she studied for a PhD in Mass Communications at Leicester. And that PhD was on the representation of British Muslims in the British press. She followed that PhD with a lectureship in media studies at Staffordshire University before moving here to Keele in 2012. And she came here as the programme director for media, communications and culture within the School of Humanities. Now, as well as studying the press and broadcasting, Liz has completed research on religion in the media, on interpretation by audiences of news about diversity, and in the course of that has undertaken interviews with journalists producing the news, and more recently studied patterns of online hate speech. She wrote the first and what is now considered the seminal book on the representation of Muslims, which was Reporting Islam in 2002, and as well as two other books and many other publications. Her work has been funded by AHRC, ESRC, and the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, and indeed the British Academy. She is an elected member of the Association for Media, Communications and Cultural Studies, and she has been indeed Programme Director of Media at Keele for 5 out of the 7 years that she has been here. Importantly, we invite our academics to engage with a broad community in terms of groups outside the university, and Liz regularly engages with such advocacy groups such as the Muslim Council of Britain, and she has contributed to reports of the Commission on Religion and Belief in Public Life and the All-Party Parliamentary Group into Islamophobia. So today, Liz will take us through her work over that period that I've talked about. So please do welcome Professor Elizabeth Poole to deliver her inaugural lecture, Shifting Stories, Same Suspects, Media Representations of Muslims from Rushdie to the Far Right.
Thank you, Professor Macmillan, for that introduction, and thank you very much for coming tonight on this cold, blustery evening, but at least it wasn't last night, so that's something. So I chose this image for my marketing because I wanted to show a positive representation of Muslims in the media, one of a woman who's choosing to wear hijab and one who's choosing not to. And I'd like to thank my students for taking part in that photo and to James for taking it. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the representation of Muslims over a 20 or so year period, which is how long I've been studying them for. And I'm going to talk about the changes and continuities in that representation. And I often get asked when I tell people my research subject, are you religious? Well, I came to this from a socio-political interest, really, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to study this subject now. So, this is the specials. This is the group that were playing when you entered the room. The lyrics in the specials music is quite bleak. It's about social commentary, about social and economic discontent in the 80s, about being young, working class, mixed race. But they also had a positive message about multiculturalism. And this was a positive representation for me, which their most prominent song, Ghost Town, it came out in 1981, just before the Brixton and Toxteth riots. And this Sun front page is about one of those riots. And if the students were here now, I'd be getting them to deconstruct this front page, talk about the agency, the images, the text in it. And we know from research that about minorities in the media that they tend to be criminalised, they tend to be framed through a law and order discourse rather than looking at structural inequalities and discrimination. So there's this tension in kind of like positive images I was exposed to and these negative images. So some more things I remember from the 80s were stories in the newspapers about halal meat, and also these more exotic images, reductive but seductive images where you get an idea of an undifferentiated other. So my experience of diversity in the 80s is mostly mediated. But this kind of stoked my curiosity. And because you couldn't do sociology at my school, I went to do religious studies. I studied religious studies for A-level, including Islam, and then I did religious studies and education at university. And while I was teaching, I did an evening course with Warwick University. Now, all the lecturers are going to be squirming now, thinking we're going to have to do recruitment evening courses, because it was so inspiring. I did actually go and do an MA in politics and cultural studies at Warwick University. And while I was doing this MA, we studied the Rushdie affair. Okay, Salman Rushdie, he wrote the Satanic Verses, and a lot of people, some Muslims, found this blasphemous, and it resulted in the fatwa from Ayatollah Khomeini on his head. But I found this sufficiently interesting to want to go and do a PhD about the representation of Muslims at Leicester. So this is kind of a story about the value of education. And this is where this brought me to where I am now, which is teaching media studies. And I can't really be on a public platform like this without saying something in defence of media studies. Okay. Media studies is routinely dismissed in the media, ironically, for being a Mickey Mouse degree, okay? And this is what we say to this: the mouse that roared. Okay, so I think it's dismissed because it's critical of systems of power, including mediated power, and also because of intellectual hierarchies about cultural value, educational value. But what I do is media sociology. Okay, so we critically deconstruct systems of power, and we try to teach our students to be engaged in social justice issues. So, for example, Ken Loach, who's obviously a film director, he gives his name to one of our prizes, and he sent us an email in the summer, and he said, all who have a platform to communicate should join the struggle for social justice, equality, dignity and security for everyone. And I think the students do us proud in this respect. And apart from the fact that the media is so important to our lives and our interactions with it, in a world where it's so integrated into our lives, media studies students are highly employable. They learn transferable skills and flexibility that's needed to communicate. So this is kind of what we do. We study the political economy, the context of the media, the commercialisation, for example, the commercial environment and the impact of that on media and democracy. We study production, the institutional norms and values that have an impact on media content, representation, whose views are represented, and audiences, how our lives are shaped by the media. So I'm going to be touching on a few of those things tonight. It's a quote from my esteemed colleagues on the MEXA Executive, that's our subject association. Far from being weak-minded celebrity wannabes, the young people attracted to media studies want to intellectually examine their place within systems of representation and relations of power that often deny their own experiences. Okay, so we can't have a media studies lecture without Stuart Hall. Okay, Stuart Hall has left a huge legacy in media and cultural studies and has partly been responsible for decolonising the curriculum. And he said representation is a social process. It's a process of producing meaning in a social context. So signs or signifiers are brought together, composed to produce meaning. And this isn't reflective of some objective reality, but is filtered through interpretive frameworks to produce ways of seeing. Okay, and he argues that race and ethnicity are floating signifiers. In other words, they're empty signifiers that can be filled with the meaning of a particular context or of certain people's interpretive frameworks. But as social constructs, they can be contested. And I would argue that the signifier Muslim in the media is used in a similar way. It's filled with meanings from a particular interpretive frameworks from particular contexts. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that context now, the actual context that's allowed this kind of representation to occur. So the various activities of Islamist groups across the world and their responses to experiences of colonialism has positioned these groups as the new enemy of the West in a post-Cold War context. In addition, neoliberal policies have accelerated globalisation, eroding boundaries, increasing immigration, and have led to a postmodern crisis of identity, which has increased nationalism and also led to a reassertion of other identities, such as religion. So the Rushdie affair was the kind of event that saw Muslims mobilising around their religious identities in the UK. And for this, their loyalty was questioned, and this furthered their politicisation. Now, previous to this, equality policies have been based on a race relations framework that is informed by colonialism, which excluded or marginalised other identity markers. Okay, so also important for understanding how representation of Muslims occurs in the media in general is Edward Said's Orientalism. So Edward Said said Orientalism is a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient. So various institutions in the West, including academia, have produced knowledge about the Orient as inferior and has allowed the Orient to be managed, including colonial practices. And although this kind of boundary between the Orient and the Occident has now broken down, it's still important for informing, this historical knowledge is important for informing our ongoing interactions, both internally in a national context and externally. And it's kind of led to a shift from to cultural racism, from racism as a focus for prejudice. And of course, this allows people to say things that without being accused of being racist. Okay, and because I found this context important, what I wanted to do in my work is look at the representation of British Muslims in a British, in the British news context. So research shows that representation of Muslims in international news is very reductive, it's essentialised, it represents Muslims as backward, barbaric, static, despotic, and motivated by belief. So I wanted to see whether there was any differentiation in the representation of British Muslims because of the need for political stability within the local context. Obviously, that part of the demographic of the media audience is going to be different ethnic minorities and Muslims. So I wanted to focus in my work on the kind of topics that Muslims were being covered in. So what news frameworks were establishing about Muslims, and when were Muslims newsworthy to the British press? And the methodologies I used in these different projects were all rigorous and systematic, so I haven't just chosen news articles to fit my argument. Okay. So most recently I've been working on an article about religion in the media more broadly, which looks at 3 days over 3 years in 3 newspapers. And you'd be surprised to know, actually, that the media is broadly positive towards religion in general, but not Islam. Okay. So this was the last article I looked at in the Times about the writer Hanif Qureshi. And Hanif Qureshi is presented as an ideal assimilated subject, a moderate Muslims, because you get this binary between good and bad Muslims. And he's presented as this positive, moderate Muslim because he aligns himself with dominant views and policies, particularly in relation to free speech. So this is a byline, Hanif Qureshi, on why writers should give more offence. So freedom of speech has been quite a dominant theme in the representation of Muslims across the period that I'm looking at. So this is 1997, the first article, 2009. And freedom of speech is an example of the secular sacred, a sacred value, which obviously the press has got invested interest in protecting. And, you know, obviously it is a sacred value, but it's the way it's being mobilised here to position Muslims outside Britishness that's the problem. So these stories on freedom of speech, this is the one with Rushdie on, is about Jack Straw's plans to extend the blasphemy laws. And this one is about Geert Wilders, the Dutch MP who was banned for coming to Britain for hate speech. They position Muslims in a homogenised way as censorious, and they also attack elites for their alignment with Muslims. And both these articles come from the Conservative press, and they're attacking Labour governments for allowing the Islamification of the UK. And while they champion some rights in the kind of liberal rights discourse, like women's rights, this doesn't include freedom to practice religion. So we can say that it's a type of exclusive liberalism, and it demonstrates the limits of liberalism. But what this story about Wilders does allow the press to say is the unsayable about Islam. So, for example, this is one quote from the Sunday Express. So the event does also convey an important message. If we in the West fail to stand up for our own values of liberty, freedom of speech, tolerance and democracy, they will be swept away by the growing demands of Islam, which Wilders argues is incompatible with European values. Wilders is not Abu Hamza. His film doesn't preach hate. Debatable. It preaches that tolerance of the intolerant will ultimately lead to the end of tolerance, and with it our civilization. Wilders may be wrong about a lot of things, but he's not wrong about that. It really encapsulates everything there is to say about the Conservative press's coverage of Islam, but I am going to say a bit more. So, I mean, there's a few issues with freedom of speech. One of those is who has got the power to speak. There are already restrictions on freedom of speech anyway in our country. And also, there's kind of a hypocrisy in terms of the press trying to suppress certain views as well. Okay, so I'm going to come back to topics. Actually, I did just want to say, I should have said this at the beginning, there is some offensive images and content in this lecture, obviously, but please don't confuse the press views with my views. It has happened in the past, so just wanted to make that clear. So I'm going to come back to topics. I'm going to talk about frequencies first. So frequencies, the number of times things appear in the press, is a measure of importance. What issues are important to elite groups in society at a particular given moment? And we can see from these charts that news about Muslims became a lot more salient after 9/11. Okay, and 9/11 is marked out as a significant moment when we move to a new kind of politics, and some people think the negativisation of Islam got worse. And I'm going to show here some of the continuities and differences. What's interesting about this is, for one thing, it shows the massive increase in the volume of coverage after 2001, almost doubling in terms of the amount of volume. Also, it shows how international news, so news about Muslims internationally, is much more significant in terms of volume than coverage of British Muslims. So those frameworks are going to be very informative in when people are thinking about and understanding Muslims. But it also shows you how a right-wing framework starts to overtake a left-wing framework after 2001. So the purpley-blue line is the Times, and the pink line is the Guardian. And before 9/11, ethnic minorities, coverage of ethnic minorities is much more salient in The Guardian. But after 9/11, when things moved to much more of a terrorism framework, then the Times coverage took over. Okay, so to illustrate that, this is just coverage of British Muslims. Okay, these charts show after 9/11, most of the coverage of British Muslims was about terrorism. So 40% of the articles in the Times, 31% in the Guardian. And also it shows how the framework of reporting reduced to only a few topics, really. So the 21% in the Guardian and the 19% are other categories outside these few topics in which Muslims were discussed. And you can see that discrimination was an issue for The Guardian, but in the Times it was less of an issue, and they focused more on finance and crime. Okay, so this was like the major difference between coverage before and after 9/11, was the shift from talking about extremism to terrorism. So before 9/11, Muslims in Britain, or British Muslims, weren't really defined as terrorists. Sometimes they were discussed in relation to terrorism activities. So here are a couple of examples, but there were more caricatures. So this article about Omar Bakri Mohammed, very much the coverage was almost mocking him and making fun of him. Whereas after 9/11, the representation became much more sinister. So there was a focus on these unrepresentative but overrepresented preachers of hate, as the tabloid coins them. This one from The Sun, for example, trying to demonstrate the perfidiousness, so the hypocrisy of preachers of hate, that they don't practice what they preach, and then linking this extremism to welfare, being a drain on resources. So there's clearly an anti-immigration stance here, and a kind of, it allows for cuts to welfare. It creates an environment that allows for kind of cuts to welfare. The press and the media in general were also criticised for using extremist sources. So here we've got a picture of Anjan Chowdhury, an extremist on Newsnight. The problem with this kind of construction of extremism, or Muslims associated with extremism, is when Muslims then wish to speak out on political issues, they're often labelled extremists, and that depoliticises their voices. Okay, so there is also a problem with the categorisation as well, the conflation and the slippage between these terms. So this term fundamentalism was used before 9/11. It's completely dropped off the agenda now because it was the press was criticised because of its associations with Christian fundamentalism. But there's this slippage between the categories of radical, militant, extremism and terrorism. And because of the collectivisation, the homogenisation of Muslims in the press, then all Muslims are cast as a suspect community. Okay, so this is the biggest shift after 9/11, that Muslims started to be defined, British Muslims started to be defined as terrorists. And there's also a problem with the decontextualisation in these articles. So they're depoliticised. And the motivating factor in terrorism is seen to be belief rather than other multiple factors explored, like economic and social factors. Okay, so when Jeremy Corbyn, for example, tried to talk about this after the Manchester Arena bombing, he was widely criticised for politicising the issue. So there's very much a focus on strategy, police strategy, counterterrorism strategy, sympathy, emotional, sensationalist reporting that amplifies feelings of risk, and it creates a politics of fear, which it creates an environment where allows for kind of more restrictive legislation around things like surveillance, which restricts all civil liberties. Of course, the terror news cycle as well reinforces this idea of two incompatible worlds at war, which then plays into the ideologies of extremist groups like Islamist and the far right. It can increase alienation, uncertainty, and nationalism. Of course, there's an oversimplification as well in terms of how radicalisation is discussed. You know, terrorists don't get radicalised by just searching for things on the internet. So there's that kind of oversimplification as well. So education is quite a prominent topic as well. So in 2002, I said education is a topic of concern in almost a quarter of articles on British Islam, and that the debate is symptomatic of the idea that giving Islam equal status to Christianity is a contentious issue. So anxiety about education is because education is a battleground for the transmission of values. And there's a lot of anxiety about Britishness, what it means to be British, and there's a kind of struggle over identity that plays out in the British press. And the articles attempt to try and fix this. So for the conservative press, it tends to reinforce a traditional Christian identity, while as the liberal press tends to reinforce a kind of liberal secular identity. And one interesting story in relation to education was the Operation Trojan Horse story from 2014. So parents in Birmingham were encouraged to participate in their children's schooling as an issue of autonomy and to raise standards. And this was interpreted as Islamification. And because of the categorisation, the slippage from conservative ideology to radicalisation, it became a story about radicalisation. And it was linked to stories about young people going to fight in Syria. And this allowed the government to shore up its policy of implementing fundamental British values in schools, embedding prevent strategy across the public sector. So again, Muslims are positioned as a suspect community. So you can see here, this is an article that David Cameron wrote for the Mail on Sunday. He says, "So I believe we need to be far more muscular in promoting British values and the institutions that uphold them." And some people have talked about this, including some people in the audience, as muscular liberalism. So you can see this article here for the Mail on Sunday, where Muslims are positioned outside Britishness. Be more British, Cameron tells UK Muslims, and they're linked to extremism. Actually, The Guardian's coverage of this was very different, and they attacked the British government for undermining British values in terms of equality and fairness. But you can imagine the damage that this did to communities in Birmingham, to schools that had previously been rated as outstanding by Ofsted, but were then model citizens that were then seen to be outsiders. So almost the criminalising of these schools and communities. Okay. So the other main topic in the representation of Muslims in the British press is cultural difference. And this was the main topic really before 9/11. And it does increase in the number of stories, overtake terrorism sometimes. There's an abundance of stories that suggest that Muslims have inherent, essentialised beliefs that are incompatible with British values. So, for example, stories about honour killing, Sharia law, veiling, conversion, and media censorship. They all convey this idea that Muslims are incompatible, or Muslim values, beliefs are incompatible with British values, along the lines of Huntington's class of civilization thesis. And this creates a binary of us and them, and of course is very divisive. But it works to encourage an integrationist agenda, and that integrationist agenda works with the securitisation discourse, so that integration is seen as a necessity for the sake of security. Okay, and actually, this story about honour killings was complained about because it was linked. It was defined as an Islamic practice, and that was upheld by the regulator. But many more stories that are complained about are not upheld. So, for example, there was a story by Trevor Kavanagh in The Sun, who he talked about the Muslim problem, which has echoes of a kind of Nazi propaganda, and many people complained about that, and it was overturned because the code of conduct focuses on individuals, not communities and groups. Okay, so there are articles about discrimination as well, particularly in The Guardian. The Guardian's coverage since I've been studying this topic has got a lot better, a lot more Muslim voices, but it does as well set up this kind of binary between a kind of victim-aggressor dichotomy. Okay, I have overgeneralised for the sake of summarising, obviously. The media is not homogenous. There's contradictions in coverage because of the way the media interacts with social and political change. So here's some examples of positive representations: community building after Grenville, for example, after Christchurch, although we could criticise the coverage of Christchurch because it locates racism out of the mainstream into far-right extremism and in social media. And in local news, the coverage tends to be a lot more positive because of demographics. So there's a lot more coverage of these kind of interfaith events. And there's an example from Channel 4 as well of a presenter, Fatima Manji. So it's not as straightforward. It's much more complicated than I'm suggesting. But we can say there are kind of media frameworks, so consistent and narrow frameworks of reporting about Muslims in the media. And we can come back to this idea of the Muslim signifier. What does this tell us? It's an empty concept and it's being filled with this meaning. What does this tell us about the people who are representing rather than the people they are representing? So Muslims are only represented, or that Muslim signifier is only used when it fits in with this kind of framework. Otherwise, the story doesn't use that signifier. We also have to think about the absences, what's not being shown, the diversity, the nuance. For example, if we think about the representation of women, it's always stories about segregation and oppression, not about the contribution of women, for example. Now, I'm not trying to suggest this is a conspiracy, okay? Sometimes there's an agenda, sometimes it's to do with production practices. So there's multiple reasons to do with cultural embeddedness, things like that. But to summarise that part, we can see that Muslims in general are represented as a cultural threat, a security threat. They're homogenised, they're seen as a problem, and then there's this struggle around identity where different groups struggle to maintain hegemony in terms of what is Britishness. I have done research into production and into audiences around diversity issues, but I haven't really got time to discuss in much detail here today. So I'm going to let Foucault say a little bit about this. Again, you can't have a media lecture without Foucault. So he said, power is exercised over those who are known through discourse. Those who produce discourse, therefore, have the power to enforce its validity, so it effectively becomes truth. So the media creates realities for us, and because we act on them, they then reinforce that reality. And the thing about production is voice, whose voices are being represented. So an Ofcom monitoring report from last year showed that only 13% of people working in the media were from ethnic minority groups, and only 1% of those were Muslims. So, of course, this has an impact. Oh, just going to go back there. So Foucault says the media then contributes to discourse environments as it has the power to reproduce moral norms, theoretical explanations, and therefore techniques of social control. So it normalises these views, and it offers solutions, and it allows then people to be managed. Okay, so the thing about audiences is that where there is very little knowledge about Islam, the media is more likely to limit our understanding rather than deepen it. And the other thing that the media does is it mobilises people into specific identity positions. Okay, so at this point I was going to wander about a bit, but this means I've got to put this on. Okay, so I've just talked about mainstream media as being very negative. So what I wanted to do was look at kind of digital media as a different space, as a space for self-representation. And it's argued that digital media offers new potentials for identity, negotiation, visibility, and influence. And also offers an opportunity for counter-publics to form. So, along with some colleagues here, Eva Giroux and Ed de Quincy, we became interested in this hashtag, Stop Islam, after the Brussels terror attacks in 2016. And we became interested because of the kind of counter-narratives that were forming around it. So it was being reported in the British mainstream media because of these counter-narratives against the hashtag, rather than the dominant narrative of the hashtag, which is negative. Okay. Oh. When we examined the tweets, so we did a big data study and looked at over 300,000 tweets, we found that the people circulating the hashtag tended to be US actors with a very kind of political, conservative Christian identity, as you can see from these images here, and linked to these kind of hashtags, which were about bolstering Donald Trump's campaign for the White House. So, I mean, this was quite surprising to us at the time, because this was before the EU referendum, before the kind of rise of populism, and we expected there to be more of a kind of a European voice. We looked at the retweet network, so the network of people who are retweeting each other, and this on the right is the right-wing voices. That's right, isn't it? We've got the right. Yeah, are the right-wing voices, the right-wing actors, and you can see how tightly clustered they are, that network, and they're clustered around very significant nodes. So, for example, Bill Warner, who writes a very anti-Islam blog or website called Political Islam, while as the progressive voices on the left are much more sort of fluid, less tightly clustered. Okay. But when we looked at the tweets, so we looked at the top 10 shared retweets, well, we looked at more tweets than that, but in the top 10 shared retweets, they were actually more positive than negative towards Muslims. So 9 out of the top 10, we call them counter-narratives, because they were countering that dominant negative discourse about Islam. So, for example, you're all tweeting Stop Islam when study says white extremists have killed more Americans in the US than jihadists since 9/11. And this one, why is Stop Islam trending when this picture can speak for itself? There are well over 1 billion Muslims on this planet. If Islam was really about violence, you'd all be dead by now. Stop letting your TV and newspaper tell you who to hate. Okay, but when we looked again at the counter-narratives, so this is a counter-narrative tweet, it says, educate yourself, terrorism has no place in Islam, and has a quote from the Quran to support that. We saw that they were getting bombarded by flak from what right-wing actors with lots of evidence, facts, memes, quotes from the Quran to close down those voices. Now, the counter-narratives, they were the things that were getting into mainstream media. So the mainstream media was reporting on the counter-narratives. But we argued that the antagonistic interactions that caused frictions, that caused this contestation online, led to a visibility in mainstream media. Okay, so these voices that are not normally heard in mainstream media gained visibility because of this contestation. But the effective labour, the emotional labour of right-wing discourse communities closed down these voices, marginalising them. And Twitter is not a neutral actor here. Twitter was removing the really explicit hate speech, but leaving behind this ambient racism. So we argued that this reinforced long-standing representational inequalities. So Katrina Small argues we should perhaps move beyond looking at counter-narratives and look at constructing alternative narratives. So she talks about beyond marginalisation. And when I was putting these slides together, I realised I had loads of male academics at the beginning of these slides. So I used all female academics here for this slide and constructed a little symbolic wall against Trump's tirade of Twitter hate. Okay, so this is a timeline that shows you the counter-narrative, the orange line, which was really dominant or prevalent after the Brussels terror attack. But then it dropped off, and the blue line, which is the dominant narrative, Stop Islam, which kept going. It had that longevity after the Manchester Arena bombing and the London attacks in 2017. So the key thing is, why does this matter? Why does this representation matter? You know, people trivialise social media. They say it's not important. So it matters on a global level. The rhetoric of the war on terror, you are with us or you are against, or you are with the terrorists, for example, and how that excludes people. Actually, this Muslims have rights, this tweet here, is a campaign which can be seen as an alternative narrative or an alternative construction, as Schmoll talked about. It says, the war on terror with its vast death toll in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen and elsewhere could not be sustained without the dehumanisation of its Muslim victims. And here we see how that's played out in various countries and settings. And here, I'm supposed to use the laser then, is a good example of disinformation or fake news, as they like to call it these days, from just before the war in Iraq. Remember that dossier of the weapons of mass destruction? We were 45 minutes away from attack, and we now know that proved not to be the case. Okay, it matters on a national level for community cohesion. The increase in hate speech after Brexit, for example. So we can see here 76% last year were based on race, and religious hate is inflected with race, of course, because of the number of Muslims in this country that come from ethnic minority backgrounds. So, finally, the last slide. I want to leave you with a quote from Stuart Hall, the great Stuart Hall, from 2014, actually, on multiculturalism. So, Salman Rushdie said, "Mixture is how newness enters the world. Who wants to be the same throughout time? What you want to do is to be different throughout time. It's a process of becoming, not of being. Society is kind of drifting into this. It's what I call multicultural drift. But what it is not yet able to say to itself is difference is good. There's something positive about people being different from oneself. I think we're on the edge of that, and I think that's what threatens is the idea that modernity is too difficult for us. Let us withdraw behind a little England citadel. That's on the cards too. I think Britain is at an important historical turning point. Thank you.